Thanks, Mike, a lot for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm really glad to be here to address the Civil War Roundtable Congress again. It's been a little bit since I've been here last time with my colleague Gene Thorpe. I know a Gene Knight too. So I'm happy to be here today and to discuss with you my new book, There Maryland, the Army of the Northern Virginia from the Potomac crossing to Sharpsburg in September of 1862. Here's the agenda. So, I wrote the book in order to take a look at a lot of the myths and other stories and what I call the received wisdom that has been passed down over the years concerning the Maryland campaign. And when I say received wisdom, I mean things that have ended up becoming part of the canon, to use a religious term, but for which there may not be much evidence or which has just been assumed to be correct, but is not. And I found over my 10 years of research and putting together this book that there are a lot of things in the Maryland campaign that have been assumed or taken as fact, but yet are not facts and are in need correction. So there are 7 chapters in the book, and they are all loosely joined or loosely related essays. So Mike asked me to cover a couple of the major issues that I address in 3 of the chapters. So you can see the ones that are highlighted here, chapters 1 and 3 and 6. Those are the ones that I'll be taking a look at and describing for you today or discussing with you today. While the other ones, you can see those. That's what the content is that is in the book and that you'll read when you decide to buy it. And so, just so you know, I'll be splitting this presentation into 2 parts. One will be a combination of subjects number 1 and subject number 6 because they are both related. And then I'll be taking a deep dive into the subject of Confederate encampments near Frederick City and then the implications for the Lost Orders debate. So let's start with why Lee moved in the Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland, what he called an expedition. That's the term that he used. An expedition meaning an exploration, right? So some of the reasons that Lee gave for moving the army into Maryland after the defeat of Pope's army at Second Manassas is to feed his troops, to recruit for his army, but also to keep Richmond safe from attack by taking the offensive. So making sure that if you push the war north of the Potomac River by moving the Army of the Potomac north of the Potomac River to follow him or to contest his move to contest his move north of the Potomac River. He thought that it would keep Richmond safe from another kind of waterborne attack similar to the one that McClellan had launched early in 1862, and then also for a possible invasion of Pennsylvania. Lee's only mentions that once, and I'll get into that in more detail. However, there are other reasons that have been given by others, and this has been called what Joseph Harsh has called the strategic dilemma. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with this who's familiar with the Maryland campaign, and that is that Lee couldn't attack the Washington fortifications because his army was not strong enough. But it also could not remain in Northern Virginia due to the lack of food in the area, or lack of supplies in the area. And it could not retreat to the Rapidan River and give up the summer's gains because that would have simply meant that his shed blood for no reason. And then also that he could not retire to the Shenandoah Valley because it would invite a federal overland advance on Richmond. So the standard argument that you will read in any history that you pick up of the Maryland campaign nowadays is that really there are 2 parts to it. One is that Lee had no choice after Second Manassas but to enter Maryland because he had no other option, and that the Maryland operation was a defensive operation. So taking the offense in order to provide a good defense for the rest of the Confederacy or for Virginia. So I have questions about the strategic dilemma. Did Lee really face a dilemma, or really was it where we dealing with post-Civil War political spin? So the claim originated with Colonel Charles Marshall, who was Lee's aide-de-camp through the war. And he responded in a letter in 1877 to the Count of Paris concerning the Maryland campaign that the Count of Paris had it completely wrong when he stated in his history of the American Civil War that Lee had entered Maryland with the intent to incite rebellion. So Marshall took exception to this, and when he responded, he outlined the reasons for Lee's Maryland expedition. He didn't say that Lee said these things or thought these things. He simply expressed his own opinion about them. So he argued that Lee had no choice but to enter Maryland, and he framed the issue as a defensive operation. So again, to protect Virginia by moving north. And this remained secret or hidden in Marshall's papers for about 50 years, until his papers were published in 1927. And they were published just in time for Douglas Southall Freeman to use them and to spread Marshall's claims far and wide, and also to give them a kind of credibility that ended up leading to other historians following Freeman's use of them for his Lee biography. And so most scholars today still consider the strategic dilemma thesis valid, but there's a big problem with this. And the problem is that there is no evidence that Lee ever considered Marshall's options. He never said anything about them. He never mentioned them. He never wrote about them, and no one else has ever said anything about them except for Marshall. So the only existing evidence that we have, which are Lee's statements, really show that his intent was to keep as much pressure on the Federals as possible by moving into Maryland and keeping them in front of him, as opposed to moving in any other direction. So is there a strategic dilemma when it comes to Maryland? It doesn't look like it, because there's no evidence for it from Lee himself, and he's the one who made the decisions. And there is also no evidence from any other source that says that Lee intended to move in that direction. What about secession or inciting secession in Maryland? So this is commonly discounted as a motivating factor. And this is despite the fact that sources at the time, including Robert E. Lee, and I'll get to those, but also the press at the time, when you read the newspapers from early September 1862, the fear of a rebellion in Maryland is very palpable. They are very worried about it. The claim is made that the situation in Maryland is not satisfactory for people who support the Northern War effort. And also, I think that there was also some suspicion that there will be problems in Maryland on the part of the Lincoln administration. And so they were kind of worried about that as well. But looking at the historians who've written, at least some of the historians who have written about this over the years, you can see that starting with Francis Palfrey, so anyone who's familiar with the Maryland campaign will know the name Palfrey. Palfrey served at Antietam and then at Fredericksburg in the Federal Army, and he was actually captured at Antietam. And he said that he didn't think that Lee had any right to expect or anticipate that My Maryland, a reference to the song, of course, would breathe or burn in any exceptional fashion or be the battle queen of yore. And then 100 years later, Stephen Sears in his book, you can see here, right, here's the strategic dilemma, east, west, south, all appeared barren of military profit. That left only an advance northward, and to the north, Lee concluded may lay manifold opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And then Sears, at least, has the intellectual honesty to say that if the Confederacy wanted to give material aid to Maryland to enable it to throw off the Yankee yoke, this was the opportunity to do so. So he took Robert E. Lee at his word. And then moving to Joseph Harsh's taking out the flood in 1999, Harsh doesn't see any connection between political motivations and military motivations. So he concluded that Lee's primary reason for entering the state had always been military and not political, and that he said that it's even less likely to place much reliance on substantial support from the state. So if you also include the opinion of Scott Hartwig, who wrote this statement in an essay on Robert E. Lee and the Maryland campaign, Hartwig concluded as well that Robert E. Lee was not so naive as to think that a brief entry and exit of his army across the state would trigger an uprising. So he maintains this position, although not as clearly, in his book, To Antietam Creek, which is the first volume of his 2-volume history of the Maryland campaign. So you can see that secession has really been ignored as a motivating factor. And I think that that really causes problems for understanding the Maryland campaign in general. So what did Robert E. Lee have to say about secession? From the very beginning, September 3rd, now, okay, on September 2nd, according to Charles Venable, Robert E. Lee made, according to Armstead Long, one of Lee's aides on his staff, he said that Lee made the decision on September 2nd to move into Maryland. And then here we have a day later, we have Lee writing to Jefferson Davis, if it is ever desired to give material aid to Maryland and afford her an opportunity of throwing off the oppression to which she is now subject, this time would seem the most favorable. That's a pretty well-known statement, and most people look at it and they just kind of throw it away and think, oh, okay, well, you know, this is just Lee trying to placate Jefferson Davis, because Davis, of course, and the Confederate government explicitly want Maryland to be brought into the Confederate fold. And so this is Lee trying to address that issue. 2 days later, Lee then writes to Davis that this army is about entering Maryland with a view of affording the people of that state an opportunity of liberating themselves. So, you know, here's Lee again 2 days later saying the exact same thing, that secession is a goal, or rebellion at least is a goal, if not secession, that he hopes to incite in the state. 3 days after that, when he's in Frederick, his army's encamped around Frederick, he then is forced to issue a proclamation. And by forced, I mean that he had intended for the former Maryland governor, Enoch Lewis Lowe Jr., who is a secessionist, was an avowed secessionist. He had called on Lowe to join the Army of Northern Virginia in Maryland. And so Lee had hoped that Lowe would be the one to issue the proclamation. But since Lowe didn't show up, he only made it to Winchester. He never made it into Maryland during the Confederate operation. Lee is forced to issue a proclamation. And so he prepares this on September 7th and then issues it on September 8th and says explicitly, our army is prepared to assist you with the power of its arms in regaining the rights to which you have been despoiled. This, citizens of Maryland, is our mission. I don't know how much more clearly you could state that this is what we're planning on doing, and if you want to rebel, we're here to support you. And then there's a statement that came out in the Philadelphia Inquirer on September 12th, 1862. Now, I had never seen this statement until I encountered it when I was doing my research for this book. And I see no reason why it should be considered to be inauthentic. It seems authentic to me. And it is allegedly a statement that Lee made to a man from Baltimore who, when he was in Frederick, and this man then went back to Baltimore and was interviewed by a correspondent of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Lee said explicitly here that we have now come to redeem our pledge to the people of this state. We extend the olive branch to them, and should they accept it, we shall welcome and protect them with the assurance that the next battleground will be in Pennsylvania. So if they rebel, he'll push the army north into Pennsylvania, and that's where the next fighting will be. But, Lee says, should they not come forward after having been amply assured that their property will be unmolested and every guarantee given that the Southern Army should remain on Maryland soil for the maintenance of their sacred rights, then the battleground must hereafter be in Maryland. So here's Lee stating on September, probably September, anywhere from 7th to 9th, right? Because in September 10th, his army moves out of Frederick, so it's unlikely that he would have interviewed this man or been in touch with this man before this. So here's Lee saying that there will be no invasion of Pennsylvania because Southerners haven't, or secessionists in Maryland have not risen up and rebelled. So that statement actually clarifies a statement that Lee had made on September 4th to Davis in a letter to Davis, where he wrote, should the results of the expedition justify it. So there was a condition, right? I propose to enter Pennsylvania unless you deem it unadvisable upon political or other grounds. So the statement that Lee issues on September 12th then clarifies the statement that he makes on that he originally made on September 4th. So the condition that Lee put on moving the army into Pennsylvania is actually the rebellion of the populace, probably mostly in Baltimore, but perhaps in other cities as well. But definitely in Baltimore, because that was where secessionist opinion was the strongest, and also where or sentiment was the strongest, but also would have cut the rail line to Washington, D.C. So there's a palpable military objective linked to a political objective here. And then finally, in his campaign report, which he filed a year later after Gettysburg campaign and everything, Lee wrote, it was hoped that military success, which can only mean victory, right? What other kind of success militarily could there be? Might afford us an opportunity to aid the citizens of Maryland in any efforts they might be disposed to make to recover their liberties. So, in other words, if you read all of these statements, it's pretty obvious that Lee has conflated both the political objective of bringing Maryland into the Confederacy through rebellion and the military objective of defeating the Army of the Potomac north of the Potomac River, and that we can only fully understand Lee's motives in Maryland and Lee's campaign in Maryland by taking into account that he wanted to incite rebellion in the state. So the question is that, if General Lee said all these things, why don't historians consider it to be one of his primary motives? What's been lost? What have we lost over the years? So one thing I think is that the strategic dilemma thesis really encourages the belief that Lee had no choice but to cross the Potomac. And what this does is it takes away agency from Lee, right? It makes him a passive, almost a passive participant in his own campaign. And that is definitely not the case, because everything flows from Lee's decisions to take his army into Maryland. The second reason I would suggest is also that I think accurate memory of the events has been lost. So if you see period newspapers and you also look at the second volume of the Comte de Paris, the Count of Paris, of his history, he clearly states that rebellion or inciting rebellion was a goal of Robert E. Lee. But that's been lost over the years versus current scholarship. And I think that the strategic dilemma thesis has a lot to do with kind of pushing that out of the way. And also the sense of Maryland being a northern state as opposed to a border state, which it was at the time. It was contested at the time. So using the term invasion would not be accurate to people like Robert E. Lee or to secessionists, which are probably 40% of the population in Maryland, maybe 30 or 40% of the population in Maryland, because it's a contested state, right? It's being kept in the Union through martial law, federal occupation, and so why would it be considered to be a northern state if it's being kept by force in the Union? A third reason that I would suggest is that there's been too much focus on George McClellan and on the Army of the Potomac, and this has left Lee's motives largely unanalyzed. So if you look at even Stephen Steers' Landscape Turned Red, he doesn't really go into much detail about Robert E. Lee. It's mostly focused on McClellan, criticizing McClellan, of course. And then, the only real history of the Maryland campaign that includes both the Confederate side and the Union side in more or less equal measure would be the histories from 1999 on. So Joseph Harsh's Taken at the Flood and Scott Hartwig's To Antietam Creek. So the focus on McClellan, I think, has left Lee kind of, and his, believe it or not, considering how much attention Robert E. Lee gets, has really left Lee's motives largely unanalyzed. The other thing I would suggest is that the Gettysburg campaign really draws away attention. And it leaves the Maryland campaign classified as Lee's first invasion of the North. So what I call his invasion of the North 1.0, when it was really a very different operation with very different goals, and a very different army in that sense, because the army of Northern Virginia that enters Maryland in June of 1863 is is twice the size and in much better condition than the army of Northern Virginia that enters it in September of 1862. So people tend to look at the Maryland campaign only through the lens of the Gettysburg campaign. So they look at it as an effort to break the will of Northern people and to push the war into hostile territory so that Lee's army can benefit from the fruit of the land in Pennsylvania, and a variety of other reasons, right? So, but they're very different operations. That's what I would suggest. And then the other thing is a statement that Lee wrote to Jefferson Davis on September 7th of 1862, in which he said, notwithstanding individual expressions of kindness that have been given and the general sympathy in the success of the Confederate states, situated as Maryland is, I do not anticipate any general rising of the people in our behalf. So this has been cited by scholars ever since, well, forever, right? Since it was uttered, the statement was uttered, that Lee didn't think that there was going to be a general rising, despite the fact that I just showed you all these other statements where he said that this is what the army is here to do, and this is what we intend to incite, the kind of rebellion we intend to incite. I think that Lee's statement needs context to be understood, and that context has not been provided in previous histories of the campaign. Because if you look at what Lee says, he says, situated as Maryland is. He doesn't anticipate the general rising. He doesn't just flat out say, I don't think that Marylanders will rise in support of our army. He says that situated as Maryland is. And situated as Maryland is, you can see the difficulty of the situation that it faced. So there are federal forces in Pennsylvania, with the long state line with Unionist Pennsylvania. Baltimore is fully occupied. Washington, D.C. is fortified. There are at least 70,000 troops left, and there's 75,000 troops left in D.C. when McClellan moves the rest of his army northwest toward Frederick. So all of this leads Lee to explain in a rather tortured way in 1863, his 1863 report. And he says the condition of Maryland encouraged the belief that the presence of our army would induce the Washington government to retain all of its available force against contingencies. So I read that to say rebellion, right? Or uprisings or secession, or however you want to put it. Which its course, the federal government's course toward the people of that state, martial law, occupation, suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, all of these other things, gave it reason to apprehend. So in other words, the Washington government would fully expect the people of Maryland to rise up, in Lee's thinking, because of the things that it had done to them and the way that it had stripped them of their rights as Americans. And so he wrote then, at the same time, it was hoped that military success, this is the statement that I read earlier, might afford us an opportunity to aid the citizens of Maryland to recover their liberties. But the most important thing I want to focus on here is Lee's statement after that, in which he says the difficulties that surrounded them were fully appreciated. So in other words, situated as Maryland is, Lee understood that they were in a very difficult spot, in a very tight spot. And so what he needed to do is he needed to prove that success, that military success he was talking about earlier, would enable them to give the people of Maryland who are inclined towards secession or rebellion assurance of continued protection, right? So Lee concluded that secessionists needed proof of the Army of Northern Virginia's ability to protect them and to stay in the state, because otherwise they're simply going to be there and then leave, and then the federal forces will move in behind them. Why would you risk your life and your property to rise up against the federal government when you don't have any other protection? So this is the reason why Lee thought that, or one part of Lee's development of Lee's thinking to include the need to protect the people of Maryland in order to give them the confidence that they would need to rise up against the federal government. So how did this all come about? Where did this change in Lee's thinking take place? Well, I think I've identified September 6th as the critical date. So this is the date that Lee crosses the Potomac River, and he is in a wagon, of course, this time after the injuries to his wrists and hands. Both of them are tightly bound, and he wears a sling on his right arm because he has broken bones in his right hand and wrist after an accident involving Traveler. And so he rides all the way to, or drives all the way to Frederick from the crossing at White's Ford. And that night, he then attends dinner at the home of the Reverend Dr. John Ross, who is the parson at Frederick First Presbyterian Church. And you can see pictures of the places. They still exist today. You can go visit them today. The parsonage is right next door to the church right there. And there, as Lee explains later in a letter to President Davis, he learns that the citizens were embarrassed as to the intentions of the army. So in other words, they didn't know why the Confederate army was in their midst. And so Lee ended up needing to issue his proclamation 2 days later to explain to them why he was there and why they were there. Hence the statement that we are prepared to assist you with the power of our arms to regain the rights of which you've been despoiled. And that's our mission. Lee then, of course, makes that statement several days later, either on the 6th or the 9th, because who knows, maybe this person who ended up being quoted in the paper in the Philadelphia Inquirer, maybe it was the night of the 6th that this person met Lee and learned what Lee was planning on doing. And so that's where that statement was made at some time during this period, this 3-day period, 3-4 day period. Where they will assure them that their property will be unmolested and that the army will remain on Maryland soil for the maintenance of their sacred rights, and the battleground will be in Maryland if they don't rise up, so that he can prove to them that he can protect, his army can protect them and their needs. So what I've concluded as a result of analyzing the sources and things is that on September 6th, Lee learned a couple of things. He learned, or September 6th, and then the next day and a couple of days afterward, he learned that the Army of Northern Virginia needed to fight in Maryland to encourage secession and to win that fight in Maryland to encourage secession. But he also learned that Harper's Ferry was still in enemy hands and needed to be captured in order to clear Lee's supply line through Winchester. So all of this led to the design of Special Orders number 191 to divide the army into 4 columns, eventually 5, but divide the army into 4 columns and surround Harper's Ferry and force its surrender, right? But what about after Special Orders number 191? So I've always, usually Maryland histories just sort of stop when you're talking about Special Orders number 191 with what Lee's plan was, where he intended to go, what the timeline was, and then it shifts to McClellan and what he did, because of course the lost orders were found on September 13th. So 191, of course, Lee divides his army into multiple columns to capture Harper's Ferry. But if you read paragraph 9 of the orders, you'll see that it states the commands of Generals Jackson, Walker, or McLaws and Walker, after accomplishing the objects for which they have been detached, will join the main body of the army at Boonesboro or Hagerstown. So in other words, Lee intended for his army to come back together deep in Washington County, west or northwest of South Mountain or the Blue Ridge Mountains, depending on what term you use. And so this map shows the potential for the different routes of march that Lee had hoped his army would be able to follow. So of course, if Harper's Ferry falls, if you look down at the bottom of the map there where Anderson and McLaws divisions are, you can see that he had hoped that they would probably be able to just march up the Pleasant Valley to Boonesboro and then follow the road from Boonesboro to Beaver Creek Heights, which is about 5 miles northwest of Boonesboro. And then Walker would join Jackson, and then either go back around the route that they had come, or that Jackson had come through Martinsburg and Williamsport in order to meet Longstreet and D.H. Hill at Beaver Creek, or perhaps to use the dotted green line there. If you can see the dotted line there, my apologies to people who are colorblind. I hope you can actually see the dotted line there. This route, march route, also provides an option to march through Shepherdstown, up through Sharpsburg, and then up the Sharpsburg Pike toward Hagerstown, and then to cut over on Lappin's Road to what's currently Lappin's Road here in Western Maryland, in order to meet the rest of the army at Beaver Creek Heights. Longstreet, of course, would come down from the area just south of between Hagerstown and Funkstown, and then D.H. Hill would withdraw from his position around Turner's and Fox's Gap, really Boonesboro, and then the army would meet up there. So Lee intended to draw the Army of the Potomac west over South Mountain. He intended to reconcentrate his army in Washington County, and he intended to give battle and defeat the Federals far from reinforcements. And the engagement was supposed to occur at Beaver Creek, 5 miles northwest of Boonesboro. And the reason that we know this is there are two mentions that Lee makes of Beaver Creek. One is on September 14th in the morning, very early in the morning, he sends a note to McLaws stating that this morning Longstreet moves down to Beaver Creek, right? And then later on in the day, probably in the early afternoon, William Nelson Pendleton, he records in his campaign report that Lee sent for him and the reserve artillery and told him to go take position at Beaver Creek Heights. So in other words, while the Battle of South Mountain, the battle for the Gaps, Turner's and Fox's Gap and Crampton's Gap, while they're all going on, Lee still thinks that he has the opportunity or will have the opportunity to bring his army together at Beaver Creek Heights if Jackson can force the surrender of Harper's Ferry. So it's pretty clear what his plan was as a result. And so this was supposed to take place after Special Orders number 191. However, Lee's plan is foiled. And several things occur, a couple major things occur actually to make this, to ruin Lee's plan. And the first is that McClellan finds, or someone in the 27th Indiana, some guys in the 27th Indiana find the lost copy of Special Orders number 191, which I will drill down into shortly, and then give them to McClellan. And so he advances faster than Lee finds convenient. That's what Lee ends up saying later. He says, this is Lee. McClellan ended up advancing faster than I found convenient. And therefore it disrupts Lee's plan. The other thing is that Lee tries to expedite Jackson's operation, but fails because Jackson doesn't have can't force Miles to surrender necessarily on his own timeline. Miles has to decide to surrender Harper's Ferry on his timeline, and so Jackson takes a day longer than Lee expects to bring the surrender of Harper's Ferry, which would free him to end Walker and Anderson to move north, right, back to meet him in Maryland. And there's my mention there of Lee informing McLaws that Longstreet will be moving down to Beaver Creek, and then sends Pendleton to the reserve artillery. However, what ends up happening is that the prompt Federal attack on D.H. Hill and the failure of Harper's Ferry to fall, that ruins Lee's plan. So McClellan, as we know, his forces, First Corps turns the Confederate left flank at Turner's Gap, north of Turner's Gap. The Ninth Corps turns the Confederate right flank at Fox's Gap, leaving the position untenable. And then, of course, the Sixth Corps pushes through Crampton's Gap, inserting itself directly in the middle of Lee's army, which is exactly what McClellan had hoped would happen and intended to happen. Uses the exact term in the center, push through the center of Lee's army. which forces Stuart and then Anderson McLaws to settle at the base of Pleasant Valley. So the route that I outlined earlier, where they would be able to move north through Pleasant Valley to Boonesboro and then meet Longstreet and Hill at Beaver Creek, that route's out because there's no way for them to make that march. So what Lee ends up doing is that he falls back toward Sharpsburg, in the direction of Sharpsburg, in order to both put his force on the flank of William Franklin's General Franklin's Sixth Corps, so that he can threaten the flank there. But also he wants to take position someplace in Maryland still, where he can try and carry out his Beaver Creek plan. And now the Beaver Creek is important because the heights there are reminiscent of what you see at Antietam Creek. So you have tall heights. They have a height. Some of them are as high as 560 feet. They stretch roughly from the base of South Mountain to Antietam Creek. So it's a very hard place to flank. So it would have required a federal frontal assault or federal frontal assaults against fortified heights or occupied heights, if you want to put it that way. And so what Lee decides to do is he fights at Sharpsburg because he finds terrain similar there to his Beaver Creek position, desired Beaver Creek position, and because it's still in Washington County, and because it's closer to Jackson and McLaws and Anderson and Walker, and can bring all of those forces together in order to win that military victory that they hoped would, or that Lee hoped would, cause rebellion in Maryland. So to sum up everything, General Lee didn't face a dilemma when it came to his victory at Second Manassas. He wanted to carry out Confederate policy and bring Maryland into the Confederacy by fomenting rebellion. He crossed the Potomac to incite rebellion in Maryland that would take the state out of the Union. But when it doesn't erupt, he seeks a reason why, and secessionists and Frederick tell him that they need to know why the A&B or how the A&B will protect them against federal reprisals. And then they probably claim that the people will rise up if the rebel army wins a victory at the state. I make that assumption because of what Lee ends up saying was his rationale for the second half of the campaign. Lee also learns at the same time that Harper's Ferry garrison is still in place. And he also learns that George McClellan is back as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Now, I know that Joseph Harsh has stated categorically that there is no contemporary evidence from that Lee knew McClellan was in place as the commander. And that's true, except for perhaps the statements of John Walker, which are considered to be unreliable. However, I have at least 5 sources, if not more, that show that a number of privates and also Brigadier General Dorsey Pender all knew that McClellan had been put back in place because of rumors that had reached or information that had reached Frederick as of September 6th. So I can't imagine that Robert E. Lee would not have heard that General McClellan was back in charge of the command of the Army of the Potomac when ranked privates know that McClellan's there. So Lee anticipates McClellan will move slowly, what Lee calls his cautious policy, and that so he will have the time to, in Special Orders number 191, to capture Harper's Ferry and then reassemble his army in Washington County, Maryland, for that decisive fight at Beaver Creek. However, Jackson taking one day longer than planned to capture the ferry, and McClellan moving faster than convenient, forces Lee to defend the passes at South Mountain, something he said he never intended to do, and that ruins his Beaver Creek plan. And then the defeat at South Mountain forces Lee to retreat toward Virginia to close the distance between his portion of the army and the other parts that are around Harper's Ferry. And then once the capture of the ferry is accomplished, Lee executes his Beaver Creek plan at Sharpsburg, but does not triumph. So in other words, Lee fought at Antietam and at Sharpsburg to carry out a plan that he had in order to try and reassure secessionists in Maryland that his army would spill blood on their behalf. Now let's drill down a little bit deeper into the situation or the subject of D.H. Hill's encampment and what the implications are for the Lost Orders debate. One thing that I should mention here is that the second part of this, the implications for lost orders debate, I did not originally intend to write on this subject. It was really, I was looking at Confederate encampments around Frederick, trying to determine where they were. And when I realized where DHL actually camped, what the evidence says about him, where he really camped, then I was like, well, I've got to say something about the lost orders debate. There's nothing, I can't leave that be. So Daniel Harvey Hill, he's the commander of 5 brigades of infantry during the Maryland campaign. He absolutely loathes Yankees. His comments are very anti-Northern, and he makes them frequently too. His troops were the first to cross the Potomac River at Nolan's Ferry on September 4th, 1862. The first Confederate troops from Lee's army to set foot on Maryland soil are probably with the 3rd Alabama. And those are part of Robert Rhodes' brigade. Hill is under the command of Stonewall Jackson until the occupation of Frederick on September 6th, when he reverts to being an independent command under the overall command of Lee. But there's some confusion even in the Confederate ranks about this, but that's generally what the situation was. He's of course been blamed for the loss of Special Orders number 191 due to his name being found on the back of the lost copy. And you can see the location. I've got it circled over here on this map. You can see that that's the location, general location where the orders were found. The 27th Indiana advanced as skirmishers, a line of skirmishers up from Crumbs Ford, the area of Crumbs Ford where the 12th Corps, Federal 12th Corps crossed, and then stopped within about a mile of Frederick. Also, Colonel Silas Colgrove of the 27th Indiana, he wrote that in an 1886 article in the Century magazine that, quote, "We stacked arms on the same ground that had been occupied by General DHL's division on the evening before." The problem is with this is that the only reason that Colgrove had for making that assumption is reading Hill's name on the back of the orders that were addressed to him. So if you look at whatever descriptions or the few descriptions that are available of the ground where they stopped, where the 27th stopped, and versus what the other condition of the other grounds were like, where Confederates had camped for 5 days, 4 and 5 days, depending on which command we're talking about, you can see that there's a discrepancy here. There's a difference. So Edmund Brown, he described it as laying down upon clean grass. Okay, and Captain David Vance, he wrote that they advanced to a field where there had been a fence, but was only a row of weeds, grass, and some small shrubs and bushes. Another one, George Welsh, he said that they stopped to rest in an old meadow. And then finally, John Bloss, Sergeant John Bloss, says that we found the dispatch in a wheat field under a locust tree. So none of them mention the things that you would expect to see or to find if you had an encampment area or an area upon which tens of thousands of Confederate troops had camped for 4 days. J. Newton Terrell of the 14th New Jersey, he describes it down by the B&O Rail Bridge. So this is on the Best Farm proper. He says that we found the remnants of wagons there, dead horses and mules. And then Jacob Engelbrecht, a diarist and Frederick resident who went to visit the place on September 21st, he recalled the stench was very offensive from the offal of their butchering. Several dead horses and one secessionist black man was laying in the field dead and uncovered of earth. His clothes and boots were still on. So none of the descriptions from the men of the 27th Indiana mention anything like this. They don't mention discarded newspapers, broken bottles, old campfires, ruined equipment, lost items, photographs, knapsacks, old uniforms, any of the stuff that you would expect to find in a large encampment for several days. The reason that they do that is because DHL's command never camped anywhere near where the orders were found. And as a matter of fact, I found no evidence that any Confederate command had camped near where the orders were found. So if you look at the map over on the other side of your slide there, D.H. Hill's division, all of the evidence shows that they camped about 3.5 miles away from that location, along something today called, which is today called Ballinger Creek, but was called Ballinger's Creek back then. So from Robert Rhodes' brigade, there's a source, John Tucker from the 5th Alabama, stopped within 4 miles of town. Ballinger's Creek is 4 miles south of Frederick. You have Colonel Alfred Colquitt's brigade saying, we stopped within 4 miles of Frederick City after marching from Buckeye Town. He means Buckystown, which you can see at the base of your map there. And the regiment pitched camp there and remained there until the 12th. He means the 11th, but they remained there until the 12th. Then you have Brigadier General George Anderson's brigade, and they crossed the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and camped in a fine grove for the night near a very large spring of good water. So this location, I'm pretty sure, is a place that used to be called White Oak Springs Farm, where there were about, as far as I know, I've read as many as a dozen freshwater springs spread out across an area that was filled with locust trees and with all kinds of other beautiful forest. So it was a beautiful area. But then on September 8th, Anderson's command then gets orders to move. And what they do is they march 3 miles from to a new camp where they cross the B&O Railroad, so the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, and they also cross the Monocacy River, where the Turnpike Bridge crosses, and that they camped in a beautiful grove of chestnuts on a high ridge. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the area of Frederick, if you look at your map over there, you can see Anderson on the far side there. That distance is roughly 3 miles from Anderson's camp to the bridge, where you'll see the name McLaws and the Railroad Bridge and Monocacy Junction, all of those things combined there. And that across the river on the east side of the Monocacy is a high ridge. And parts of that ridge are forested at the time. Parts of it are still forested today, but more of it was forested, I think, back then. So his command shifts its position to be in the middle of where Jackson's command is camped, because Jackson's command is split into two pieces. He's got Lawrence O'Brien Branch, who is the commander in temporary command of A.P. Hill's division, because A.P. Hill is under arrest at this point in time. And then north of the railroad, you can see Alexander Lawton's division, which was Richard Ewell's division. Ewell had been wounded at the end of August in Northern Virginia. And so Anderson moves and camps, his men basically camp among Jackson's command there, right? And then finally, Roswell Ripley's brigade, it marched to Buckystown on September 6th. And then on September 9th, it marched an additional 3 miles and lay down to rest. So Ballinger's Creek is 3 miles north of Buckystown. So one has to wonder if Ripley's command was stationed at Buckystown due to the bridge over the Monocacy River that's very close to Buckystown there as a defensive measure. But when Hill gets wind of the orders that let Lee, his special orders number 191, that they're going to be moving out, he then moves his command north to join the rest of D.H. Hill's division along Ballinger's Creek. So unfortunately, there are no records that I've been able to find so far for Sam Garland's brigade, but one would assume that Garland would camp in the same vicinity as the rest of the division. So in other words, Hill's 5 brigades camped 4 miles south of Frederick along Ballinger Creek, and there's no record of any Confederate Union camping at the location where the lost copy of Special Orders number 191 was discovered. As for D.H. Hill's headquarters, there are 2 places where it's possible. I don't have the evidence isn't more compelling for one than the other. I'll simply mention both of them. One is a place called the George Markell Farm, and that is over along Ballinger Creek, very close to Ballinger Creek, along the floodplain or near the floodplain, across from Best's Grove, or close to Best's Grove, about a mile away. So Hill claimed after the war that his tent was within sight of Robert E. Lee's. So that location is viable. You can't tell today because of all the development in that area, but that location is viable as a potential location for his headquarters, and it also is in the middle of his command. But the other possibility is that that Hill may have actually stayed in a house owned by a man named General Cooper in Frederick. And newspaper reports, I get this from newspaper reports that surfaced during the Confederate occupation, that said that the home of General Cooper had been seized for rebel HQ in town. And the Cecil Whig, so this is in Maryland, noted on September 13th that all of the troops in Frederick were under the command of General Hill, based on information from a man who had been in Frederick until September 6th. So the possibilities are that either Ballinger's Creek or around the Markel farm, you're close to Ballinger's Creek, is where Hill camped, or he stayed in the General Cooper house. Again, if you looked at the map on the right-hand side where it says General Cooper house, neither of these locations is close to where the Special Orders number 191 were found. So that makes it even more mysterious as to why they were lost where they were. So what are the possibilities here, right? What are the possibilities? So we know I'd like to put forward a suggestion here. I don't have an answer to who lost the orders, but I do have a strong suspicion that I'd like to put forward. And that's based on the fact that all of the copies of Special Orders number 191 are accounted for, except for the copy that may have been given to General William Nelson Pendleton. We don't know if Pendleton had a copy of the orders, but we do know that he knows Lee's plans, because he visited Lee's headquarters on the morning of September 8th and wrote days later that after reporting to General Lee on Monday morning, I spent the day in calling on my old friends in Frederick. I must not indicate where, lest my letter fail and give some clue where I would not have information gotten. So in other words, he knows Lee's plans, right? So it says, suffice it to say that General Lee seems to know well what he is about. So even though Pendleton may not have, there's no evidence directly that Lee gave Pendleton a copy of the orders, he seems to have known, Pendleton seems to have known what Lee's plans were anyway. Captain James Blackshear, one of the artillerists in Pendleton's reserve artillery, he wrote that Pendleton lodged at a house as usual while in Frederick. Sort of sarcastically, he's very mocking of Pendleton. Stepping back a little bit here, Pendleton reported what he called a crisis of diarrhea of some weeks to duration in a letter dated August 31st of 1862. And that was caused by malaria. Pendleton had contracted malaria, like a lot of these officers had contracted malaria earlier in their lives. McClellan had malaria. Robert E. Lee had contracted malaria. It was very common back then. And Blackshear mocks the general in his diary on September 8th, saying that Pendleton is pretending to be sick. So is he pretending to be sick, or is Blackshear simply mocking Pendleton, despite the fact that he really is suffering from a crisis of diarrhea with yet another flare-up of his malaria. Then there's the fact that the lost copy of Special Orders number 191 were found on the farm of a man named Elias de Lachemute Jr. And he belongs to a family of known Confederate sympathizers. And if you look at the map on the other side, you can see I've got it circled that's the place where the orders were found, and it's very close to the farmhouse where de Lachemute's farmhouse. And you can see Lee's HQ is just down the rail line there. So, did Pendleton stay at de Lachemute's house? That's the place where he is lodged at a house as usual, and he was suffering from malaria at the time. And then finally, although the letter or the orders, the copy of the orders is addressed to D.H. Hill, paragraph 7 of the orders also pertains to Pendleton's command. So it mentions Hill's division will form the rear guard of the Army. The reserve artillery, ordnance, and supply trains, etc., will precede General Hill. So there's a reason for Pendleton to have had a copy of the orders in his hands. So the question is did Pendleton lodge with Elias de Lachemute and experience a new bout of malarial fever? He visited Lee before heading to Frederick to visit friends. Did Lee order Colonel Chilton to give Pendleton a copy of the orders in development? hence a scratched out date indicating iteration. So if you look at the date, which I've got highlighted down here, you'll see that there's a scratched out. This is the copy that was that ended up in McClellan's hands. So you can see that there's a date that's been scratched out there, and then 9 noon has been added to it. So were these orders written out on the 8th? And I posed that question because D.H. Hill moved George Anderson's brigade to a rear of the Army's march to Jackson's command, where it was camped on that date. And then Anderson brought up the rear of the for the remainder of the when the Army marched out on the 10th. So if Pendleton was not feeling well, or he was carrying these orders that he did not want to be carrying, he wanted to put them safe with his belongings, and he rode back toward Delashmute's house, but he stopped because he was stricken with a bout of diarrhea. And remember what the descriptions of the place look like. There are bushes there, there's a fence row, or what used to be a fence row, tall grass near a fence row, and a locust tree. So and there's no one camped around there either. So it's a perfect place if you have to use the facilities, to use a 20th century term. But if he ended up needing to get off his horse and actually deal with this diarrhea, did he lose the orders there? And then he didn't realize it later, and then later also until later, and then didn't mention it because he was afraid of being shamed or removed from command or shot, depending on what the situation is. So that's the theory and the implications. But Pendleton, to me, seems like the most likely candidate based on what the evidence shows. So to sum up again here, D.H. Hill's division camped 3.5 miles southwest of the place where the orders were found. There's no evidence, physical evidence, or written evidence of a Confederate unit camping where the orders were found, or of Hill's headquarters. It was either at the farm of George Markell or in Frederick at the Cooper House. It makes it more likely, I think, that a third party lost the orders, if knowing that Hill's division camped far away from the place where the orders were found. Also, all known copies of Special Orders 191 have been accounted for, leaving the possibility that there was a copy that was unaccounted for. So that again suggests a third party may have had a copy. I mentioned the relocation of George Anderson's brigade east of the Monocacy River. Pendleton knows Lee's plans on September 8th. It looks like the scratched out date on the document. He had a reason to be carrying Special Orders number 191. He may have lodged with a family of known Confederate sympathizers whose house lay in the direction of the location where the orders were found. Pendleton was suffering bouts of malaria-induced diarrhea at the time. The place where the orders were found is out of the way and en route to the Delashmute farm. And so based on those circumstances, I believe that Pendleton is the most likely candidate for the man who lost Special Orders number 191. So with that, I'll wrap up. Just to provide here's the copy of the cover for the new book. I just received it today, so it's happy to see it. And please, there are signed copies available at Savitz Beatty, and I hope you'll find it compelling enough or interesting enough to buy a copy. Thanks very much for listening, and really appreciate again, Mike, for having me here. Thanks.